If you're thinking about buying your first flash, congratulations. One of the best things you can do for your photography is to start taking control of the lighting conditions for your subjects. It doesn't matter if you're doing portraits, which is what I prefer, or if you're doing any other kind of subjects. If you can control the light, the direction of the light, the quality of the light, meaning is it hard or soft, the amount of light that you're putting on your subject, and of course the color of your light, all of these things you can do much more easily with flash than you can working with available light. So that's what we're going to talk about today is 10 things that you want to consider before you buy your first flash system. Hi, my name is William Beem. I'm a portrait photographer in Central Florida. And as a portrait photographer, I tend to use flash photography quite frequently. So what does that really mean? It's like, can you take portraits without a flash? Of course you can. There are a lot of people who call themselves natural light photographers. And that basically means that they can take photos as long as there's some other light source around rather than one that they can control with a flash. I prefer having flash with me. I don't necessarily have to use it all the time. Sometimes available light works very well. Sometimes it's dark and I need a light, so I use a flash. This little thing is the very first electronic flash that I ever bought. It's from Olympus, and there's a little hot shoe down here. And in case you're not familiar with that, a hot shoe is the point where it mounts on the top of your camera, and a little electrical signal from your camera will tell the flash when to fire. And it'll also give it a little bit more information with some systems. Some of them that you see today are electronic. They have different little panels on them where you can control the lighting. This one just had a couple of sliders, and you didn't make any changes. Basically, the flash went off at the same power all the time. Also, because it's fixed, in other words, there's nothing on here that will flip or move. This thing only fired on top of the camera, and it only fired in one direction, straight ahead. I can promise you that is probably the very worst place to put a flash. It will document your subjects by putting a burst of light on them, but it is the least flattering way, particularly for portrait subjects, to add light to your subject. You typically want to have off-camera flash, but there's more to deciding on what you want for your flash system. So let me go ahead and we'll walk through the 10 things that you want to consider before you buy a flash. Before we get started with the 10 things, I just want to put this little point out there. All light is natural. I mentioned in the beginning, there are some people who say they are natural light photographers. Using a flash is not artificial light. Light is nothing more than photons in the visible spectrum. It's electromagnetic energy, and these little photons travel in waves and they hit your subject. If it comes from a flash, if it comes from a candle, if it comes from the sun, if it comes from a lightning bug, it's light. It's all the same thing. Artificial is something that's very different, but does the same job. So for example, if you have sugar, that's natural. If you have sweet and low, that's artificial. Both are sweeteners. Both are not natural. When it comes to light, all light is natural. So don't be afraid of flash thinking that it's somehow inferior to the light that's coming from outside. You can control the quality, direction, and all those other things much more easily with the flash, but you have options. So don't worry about whether you're using available light, whether it's from the sun or a neon sign in a window, or if you're using available light because you happen to have a flash in your bag. Another concept you may have heard about is flash versus strobe. So what really is the difference between a flash or a strobe? Here are a couple of examples. On the left side is a flash. It's a popular one, the Godox 8200. This particular one is from Adorama. They brand the same flash. It's called Flashpoint with our brand, and they call it Evolve 200. I've got a couple of those. It's one of my favorite flashes of all. Next to it is something that's commonly referred to as a strobe. It's a much larger device, and it has much more power. It puts out more light. It typically has to go on a stand, as you see there. And they can be powered either by electrical outlets or by batteries. This particular one happens to have a battery pack. I have some Elenchrom strobes that must be plugged in. So the idea is that strobes are bigger and more powerful, but they both do the same thing. They both put out a burst of white light. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing before you buy a flash is, what do you want to do with your flash? And it sounds like a simple question, but it's obviously overlooked by a lot of people because they go buy a flash and then they figure out how they're going to use it. Kind of get an idea of what do you want to do with your flash. So here are a few examples. On the top left, that's a portrait, and it's done with soft light. In other words, someone had to go put a softbox or some kind of light modifier to soften the light and make the shadows a bit more soft and kind of have a gradient from highlight to shadow. Beneath is a photo of with hard light. In other words, it's kind of like a bare bulb thing. There's like a little reflector that channels the light at them, but it was shot her with hard light because she's young, she's beautiful, and she can take that light. And sometimes you want a hard light subject or a hard light on your subject. On the right side is an example of a stroboscopic flash. In other words, while the shutter is open, the flash fires multiple times so you can see a progression of movement with the subject. You can see this with sports figures like this. You can see it maybe with a billiard table. You can also see it in dance where you see a subject is kind of dancing and moving across the stage as the shutter stays open and the flash fires, and you get little sharp spots of the person as they move along the stage. Not all flashes are going to do stroboscopic quite the same way. Not all of them are going to have the same mounts, but you can do a lot of things with one flash. But keep in mind, what do you want to do? How far away is your subject going to be? Do you need to freeze motion? These are all things that you want to consider when you're buying your flash. This is another example. Sometimes you don't put the flash on your subject. Sometimes you might want to create a background that's interesting. There are products that you can get or even build them yourselves to put in front of the flash that will add color, that will add patterns of light. So you can just make a dull wall into something a bit more interesting. I mentioned light modifiers. Light modifiers are items that you put in front of your flash to change its behavior. So we mentioned that you can make your light hard or soft. You can add color to your light. You can add shapes. All of those things are light modifiers. This is a speed ring. In particular, this is an Elinchrom speed ring. And it does a couple things. One, it holds the softbox if you're using that together. And two, the other end will attach to the front of your flash or strobe. Now you can see on the bottom of this, on opposite sides, there's kind of like little hooks. Elinchrom is different than other brands. It kind of slides on and then you turn it to lock it in place. Those little metal things that are sticking out from the side attach to rods, which kind of hold up the structure of a softbox. But that's the way you mount things, is you kind of click it into place on your flash or strobe, and then the other end holds on to the box that you're using. They don't all use rods, but that's an example of one. There are different types of speed ring mounts, and this is something you want to consider when you're shopping around, is you want something obviously that's compatible with your flash and compatible with your softboxes. Basically, it's like middleware. It is the thing that connects the box or whatever light modifier you have to your flash. Bowens is a very popular one. Profoto is another popular one. Elinchrom, I mentioned, their brand is called Rotolux. And you can also see that we have some here from, Balcar, Paul C. Buff, Broncolor, and Interfit. So keep in mind, when you buy a flash, you want to know that you have a way to mount it to light modifiers. And you're probably going to end up with more than one light modifier. So you don't want to have a different mount for each light modifier. You want them to all use the same mount. That may determine what light modifiers you buy and to go with the flash and the mount that's on it. Typically, when you buy a flash or strobe, it only has one type of mount. There are modifiers you can get, but then they kind of stick out a little bit from the light source, and the light doesn't spread inside the modifier as nicely as it should. So you want to make sure that you're getting a light modifier that works with your flash. This is an example for a flash that's kind of like the one I just showed you before, the Evolve 200. It doesn't have a speed ring on it because it's just a rectangular flash. So what you do is you put it in this thing, which looks like an ancient torture device. On the other side is a mount. In this case, it is a Bowens mount. So if you have soft boxes for your strobes that you also want to be able to use with your flash, this device is one way that you can go ahead and attach the same light modifiers to both your flash or your strobe. All right, this product is from a company called MagMod. If you want to see them, you can go to magnetmod.com. They're very popular, particularly with wedding photographers. And it's a series of magnets. You kind of stretch this around the front of your flash. And on the side, you can see these very heavy magnets, and they attach light modifiers to them. Sometimes they may be something called a grid. Sometimes they may be gels that give you different color. That example I showed you with the weird squiggly pattern was using one of their devices as a light modifier to project that kind of color and pattern on the wall. And they also have a softbox that's got some interesting capabilities with it. We're not going to get into light modifiers too much, But if you just have a flash, this is a way that you can use the MagMod tools and light modifiers to quickly attach it. And you just slap them right on. You don't have to twist anything. The magnets work. So, and if it doesn't work in one direction, you flip it over and it works in the other direction. So the polarity's got to be right. But some people think they're a little bit of a bugger to get on and off. I kind of tend to leave mine on, and it works really nicely. Another question is, how much power do you need? You're going to find two ways of measuring power with flashes. There is a guide number, and then there are watt seconds. The problem with watt seconds is it depends on the manufacturer how efficiently they use watts. So if I have a 200 watt flash from one brand, it may or may not have the same power as a 200 watt flash from another brand. So there's this little thing called guide numbers, and I hate guide numbers, but they exist. So let's give you an example. Let's say that you have a flash with a guide number of 67. That means if you were shooting a lens at an aperture of f1.0, you should be able to take a good exposure 67 feet away. Now, most people don't have a f1.0 lens, so you start putting that back and dividing that number based upon the aperture that you have. So if you have an f4 aperture, then that guide number is going to be a quarter of what it was before. And if you do f8, then you have to divide it even further. So in other words, the distance that you can do your flash obviously reduces as you close down the aperture. So if you look at the guide number and check that with the different flashes and strobes you have, you'll see how far they can throw the light and still allow you to get a good exposure at a given aperture. So here's another example of power. We've got a small flash over here, and this is one that could go on camera, and it's got a little foot where you could place it off the side, or you've got a big strobe. Guess which one has more power? The strobe is going to be much more powerful, but it's also not going to be as convenient to use. It's not going to fit on top of your camera, and it's going to require a stand someplace, but it will give you much more power. And there's a good reason why you want more power, is because sometimes more power equals faster recycling time. What is recycling time? That is the time between when you fire the flash and the system recharges until it's ready to fire the next flash. One way to get around that is to use two flashes, so you use half as much power per flash while still putting out the same amount of light. So for example, if it takes 1 second at 100% power to fire this flash, put two of them together, you can fire the same amount of light with a half-second recycle time, which means you're more responsive and more reactive if there is something going on around you, or if you're working with a model, for example, who's just doing free flow modeling, and maybe you're working with a family, and you can't necessarily direct all the kids. You need to be able to fire when the moment strikes. So either you need a bigger strobe that has more power, so you can use it at a lower power setting, and it recycles quickly, or if you're going to work with flashes, you may need to double them up to get a faster recycle time. So bigger battery, more electricity, or double up and then shoot the same amount of light with faster recycle time that way. Another thing to consider is, do you need TTL? TTL means through the lens. This is a form of metering to determine how much flash output you're going to have. Some people love TTL, a lot of people don't like it. Here's the reason why. Every time you take a photo, if something changes, if you've got a subject wearing a black shirt and you are aiming or metering on their face, you'll get a different result than if you meter on the black shirt. If you change your focal length, you'll get a different result. TTL is good to get you kind of in the ballpark. And after that, typically I like to use TTL to get in the ballpark of what the right meter should be for my flash and what the right output should be. Then I switch it over to manual. Some people don't bother with TTL at all. They will just only buy manual flashes. There's a good reason for that. You can save money if you don't spend money on TTL. So for example, the flashes that I showed you, particularly within strobes that have TTL, there are also versions that are manual only. You can save $100, $150, $200, depending on which brand it is, by getting a flash or a strobe without TTL. I kind of recommend making sure you understand how to use manual flash. And that's so that you get a consistent flash output with every shot. So your metering isn't going to change the output of your flash. With TTL, that's quite a possibility. So think about that. You may want to use TTL, you may not. That's a decision, but the decision to buy a flash with TTL, you're going to pay for that. There's going to be extra cost to it. Does your flash need to tilt or swivel? This is kind of a common thing, and it's not just for on-camera flash. So let me give you an example here. These are on-camera flashes. So when I say tilt and swivel, you can see the first one on the left is tilting up and down. The one on the right is swiveling left and right. Sometimes you may want to put a flash on your camera and be able to point it behind you, maybe if you've got a white wall, and then flash on the wall and bounce that light back to your subject. What that's going to do is give you a much larger source of light relative to your subject. So instead of having this small little light source go hit them right away and it gives them hard shadows, you bounce it off of a white wall, and then you've suddenly got a very large light source that could give you a very flattering portrait of somebody. So think about that. And also, even if it's not on your camera, remember that little foot that I showed you earlier. You may be able to place this flash someplace else and then tilt it so it's kind of hidden out of view for when you're taking your composition, but it's bouncing light off the background, or maybe it's creating a color with a gel, or maybe a pattern that I showed you earlier. So the idea of having a flash that can tilt and swivel is very useful, whether it's on camera or not. Most of the flashes that I've seen have a rectangular head. So kind of going back to the flash that I showed you earlier, they were all rectangular. And if you use that mag mod, I think they call it a mag grip, it works best with a rectangular head. But there are times when you want a round head as well. So here's an example. The one on the left, rectangular, the one on the right, round head. In some cases, you can get one of your flash heads to change from a rectangular to a round head. The Evolve 200 or the Godox AD200 has a kit where you can buy this little round head, and then you can see some accessories there. There are different filters, there's barn doors, there's a snoot, a grid, and this little white thing that's coming up on the right-hand side is kind of a bounce. So in other words, you can bounce the light off of there, and you can get a round head look. In other words, that Evolve 200 becomes a very flexible thing, because not only does it have the rectangular Fresnel head, it's also got, as an accessory that's a separate purchase, this round head, and it comes with a bare flash bulb, which when you put it inside of a softbox allows the light to spread all over the place. So it's kind of got three different heads that you can put on one flash. It makes it very, very versatile. This is an example of Evolve 200 with the Fresnel head, in other words, the rectangular head. And you can see the pattern that it makes on the background. This is an example of it with the round head for the Evolve 200. If you want to put a spotlight behind someone, which one do you want? The rectangular or the round? The round is a more pleasing look in some cases, and that's why people will pay for a round head. It doesn't work with the mag grid, it doesn't work with the mag mod grip, in other words, with the thing with the magnets on both sides, because they weren't designed really to work on round heads. Maybe they will at some point in the future, but for right now, it doesn't really work with that. But if you just want to put a nice spot back there, it's a good way to do that. Another thing you want to consider is, does it have a wireless trigger? That helps you get your flash off camera. And trust me, you want to get it off camera. You're going to have much more flattering results if you can change the direction of the light. But a wireless trigger, they're not all the same. The one on the right is something I used to use with Nikon. They had something called CLS, Creative Lighting System, and it worked off of a light-based system. In other words, there had to be a line of sight between this commander and another flash in order to trigger the flash. And quite honestly, depending upon conditions, it worked well sometimes, and it didn't work so well other times. The one on the left is a radio trigger. Radios can go around corners. In other words, you can hide your flash someplace. It's still going to get the radio wave, and it's still going to be able to trigger. With the CLS system, which was Nikon only, and there were other, photo triggers out there where they had kind of one would be the transmitter, one would be the receiver, and they were based on seeing a burst of light. They had to see it. They couldn't be hidden away someplace and have the light, appear from out of sight. You want a radio trigger. This particular trigger is one that works with the Godox or Flashpoint brand of lights. Remember, Godox and Flashpoint are the same exact thing, just different branding. And what this allows you to do is have different groups. You can see them there as far as groups A through E. And then you also have channels. At the top, you see where it says CH1, you can have channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, and on up the line. So what you can do is you can assign multiple flashes to either different groups or to have multiple flashes on the same one, but maybe you've got different families of flashes. I know it gets confusing, but the idea is you have more options and choices. And the reason they give you so many channels and so many groups is to try and avoid interfering with the flash of someone else if you're working near another photographer. Another thing to think of is, do you need a modeling light? Which is basically, a modeling light is a constant light coming out of your flash or strobe, so you can see how it's affecting your subject. It's very handy sometimes if you have a modeling light and you've got a softbox on front or a beauty dish or whatever kind of light modifier you have. You're looking at your portrait subject. You want to see where the shadows fall. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it gives you an idea what kind of result you're going to get when you fire the trigger and the light comes out. I think particularly if you're doing portrait or still life photography. In other cases, you don't have to worry about that. You just know that you need a burst of light. A modeling light is not going to do any good, and it's something else that's going to be draining power. So give that some thought as to whether you need a modeling light or not, and if that's available on your flash. And also, if it has enough power to be a useful modeling light. Some flashes and strobes have a modeling light, but the power is so weak that they almost don't do you any good. So think about that. Finally, we get down to price and value. I want to show you a comparison here. There's an idea that you get what you pay for. So take a look at this. ProPhoto is a premium brand, and you can tell by the price. So what you get here is you get a flash with a round head, you get a trigger, and you get a few filters and things to help, modify your light. And for that, even on sale, it is nearly $1,200. Remember, flashes and strobes all do the same thing. They put out a burst of white light, and it's what you put in front of them that makes the difference. This is a flashpoint light that is similar. And again, you get the flash, you get a trigger, and you get a kit for light modifiers. And it's $387. It's not on sale, but look at the difference in price. ProPhoto is a great brand. Is ProPhoto light worth that much more? So you can say that you have ProPhoto? In my opinion, no. So you want to think about, are there other things that make that ProPhoto light that valuable to you? If you're working with ProPhoto system and you have other ProPhoto lights and you have ProPhoto triggers, then yeah, I'd say that would be a good reason, because you want to keep a system together. So you're working with the same trigger, you're working with the same kind of mounting systems. But for the flash that goes on camera, take a look at this. It doesn't have a mounting system that's going to work with ProPhoto light modifiers. So you got to be thinking, is it really worth it? So again, $1,195, $387. To me, my choice was to go with the Flashpoint brand. Your choice may be different, but you got to think about the reasons. Are you getting value? Now, something else to consider is the user interface. ProPhoto has an absolutely wonderful, simplistic, easy to use user interface. If you're a photographer that's going to different studios and you need to rent gear on site, most of the good studios are going to have ProPhoto gear available for rent. So if you know that system, it's available for rent, you can use it. You're not necessarily going to find Flashpoint available for rent at all those studios. It's just kind of the way they work. A lot of professional photographers work with ProPhoto. It's a good and reliable brand, but I don't think it's a better brand than Flashpoint. So you got to consider what your needs are, what your use case is. I've talked about a flash system, and I want to make sure that I get this through clearly. When I talk about a flash system, there are two things that really come together. You want to use flashes that use the same radio trigger, and specifically radio trigger. So ProPhoto triggers will work with ProPhoto flashes. If you have Flashpoint or godox triggers, they will work with godox triggers. The trigger itself is going to be camera dependent. So in other words, if you have a Sony, you want to buy a trigger that fits in the hot shoe of a Sony camera. If you have a Nikon or a Canon, you buy the trigger that fits there. And other than the flashes that fit on your hot shoe, it doesn't matter what the other flashes are. So the strobes that I showed, they don't care if they're getting a signal from a Sony, a Nikon, or a Canon, or whatever kind of camera. It's just a matter of the trigger talking to them. This helps you save money, because if you buy a lot of flashes that have to go in your hot shoe and then you switch brands, you've got a big expense to replace. On the other hand, If you have off-camera flashes and you switch brands, all you need to replace is the trigger. And that's why I like working with the Godox 8200 or the Flashpoint Evolve 200 and on up. They don't fit on the hot shoe, and it doesn't matter. So long as I've got a trigger. If I ever switch away from Nikon, which is the brand that I like, I only have to replace one device. You want flashes and strobes that can use the same mount. Now, there are alternatives. As I showed you that little S bracket, the thing that looked like the ancient torture device, you can put a flash in there, and it can be any kind of flash. And then that bracket will mount to Bowens or whatever kind of speed ring mount that you want. And the same thing is true with your flashes. The Flashpoint products typically mount with Bowens mounts. It's a very popular brand. You can find a lot of light modifiers for that. Profoto has its own mounting type, which is very different. So if you're going to use Profoto flash and you want to put it in something to mount to a larger light modifier, you want to make sure that you can find a way to mount that to Profoto. And the same thing with the other larger Profoto flash systems and strobes are going to mount with Profoto. So you want to keep like with like. I'm going to suggest that you don't buy more flashes than you need. Start off with one. Get to use it. When you run into a situation where you say, I wish I had another flash, that's when it's time to go ahead and spend the money on something else. So for example, you're going to probably start off with one light and put that on your subject. After that, you might think, it'd be interesting to have a light on the background. And then you might think of a third reason. Maybe you want to have cross lighting on your subject and a light on your background. So these things come up, and also you don't know what power you're going to need until you get into this. My favorite flash is still that Evolve 200 or the Godox 8200. It is more powerful than your standard on-camera flash. It works well with different light modifiers. It's just a wonderful light to begin with. So it's kind of in between the flash and the strobe as far as its power rating. And remember, all flashes are nothing more than putting out a burst of white light. They change how much they can put out by their power output, so you can have a 1-to-1 power output, which is 100% power. And then it goes down 1 to 2, 1 to 4, and they start cutting down your power output. But it's still white light. So do you want to spend $1,200 or $400 for the same result? As far as the output of light and what they do, they're all the same. What you're going to be looking for are the features and the system that might make one flash worth more than another brand. So now that we've taken a look at this, let me know in the comments below. Are you looking for a flash or are you looking for a strobe? Do you find a reason why Profoto is worth the price to you? Are you looking for something that's more common and easily available in studios? Or is that not important and you just want to build your own brand at a reasonable price? In my case, I have chosen the Flashpoint brand. I have some affiliate links in the description below so you can see some of the different types. I've only put the ones in that I own and use and can therefore recommend. Flashpoint and Godox have a number of different lights, but the ones I've linked below are the ones that I know, I trust, and if you have any questions, I can help you with them as well. So with that in mind, thanks so much for being here. I would love it if you would go ahead and like this video if you got something useful out of it. Share it with a friend if it would help them. Please subscribe. I'm going to do more videos on Flash, and of course, I've been doing the videos on post-processing tools. And click that little bell icon so you get notified the next time I put a video out. Thanks so much. We'll see you in the next video.